So on the heels of their conversation about Zohran Mamdani in New York and the potential of his representing some radical shift in politics and his potential to be a radical leader of some sort, we got this gem of an exchange between Brianna Joy Gray and Norman Finkelstein. And on the heels of my recent discussion of Finkelstein and his engagement with Black scholarship, Black studies, and Black history, this is sadly beautiful.
Let me ask you this, because earlier you mentioned that you regretted that you were the age you are when all of this exciting stuff is happening. Well, there's an argument. Well, there's an argument that all this happened before when you were much younger, but then the people got the stick. So, you know,
I think
I don't want to set you off, but Marianne makes this argument all the time that, you know, the wave of assassinations in
I don't believe that. I don't 60s, think that's. Yeah, I don't really.
You know,
agree.
Combined with all of the sort of Powell memo repressions, the investment in conservative media, the infiltration of the court system, all of those things sucked the hope out of these movements. And you kill enough people, and you know, there's the top level assassinations that we all celebrate in February or whatever.
In the 60s, but that's that would be a digression. Now, I think a good person for you to have on the program in the near future would be Kucinich, who became the head, mayor of.
He's been on.
So there's a broader context to their conversation here, so I don't want to be too unfair, or unfair at all. But the reality is Brianna is starting to shift the conversation to the repression of human rights struggles in the post-60s and 70s era, and Finkelstein wants to shut that down in favor of what would be the analysis we would get from a Dennis Kucinich, who, with all due respect, as a more or certainly relatively progressive, labor-minded congressperson of recent history, I'm not aware of his expertise here. But again, this is sort of a trend that we're going to see throughout this discussion of who Norman Finkelstein thinks should be read and referenced for discussions about liberation struggles here in the United States. And I think it becomes quite evident as his shortcomings and why I was saying what I was saying earlier about his engagement with Black studies. And so
yeah, he's been on, and I'd be happy to have him back. He was a terrific guest.
Because,
and I think Brianna does it. I mean, how she handles that right there is pretty. It's like, yeah. He be all right. He's been on before, but but no.
Curious why, Norm, you don't see the 60s as kind of pre-staging the moment that we're in now, given everything you just said about how you can't beat City Hall.
Because I don't think that's what happened.
Why not?
Because I think there's just so much illusion about the 60s and these radical groups, like the Black Panthers and this.
Yes, tell us, Norm. Tell us, correct us on our understanding of the Black Panther Party and similar struggles, please.
Iconization of people like Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. They were completely marginal figures. They were, as many people have said, they were basically telegenic figures.
But why was it worth assassinating them if it was just about them being telegenic? Zohran's telegenic.
First of all,
and she's asking this because just before they at some point during this discussion, they both acknowledge that they think Mamdani is likely or certainly up for consideration to be targeted for an assassination. So Brianna's asking a perfectly legit question, and look at the dismissiveness here. This is Peniel Joseph level dismissiveness of people of that era to suggest that Cleaver and Newton were just telegenic figures and of little import is wildly disrespectful, never mind historically inaccurate. But I think it speaks to how Finkelstein approaches these histories and this scholarship, and why his discussion in his most recent book of Black studies and scholarship is so poor.
As a factual matter, very few of them were assassinated. If you take the case of,
That's a
I
good
know the
face she's
history.
making there. This is, and then she's making a face that is quite legit to make, and then Finkelstein is going to chime in with his notion of authority on the subject, with saying that he remembers the '60s and lived it and was there, so he knows
Very well, believe me, because I was part of that era. I was a Black Panther groupie, a complete moron, a complete idiot. I was a Black Panther.
And maybe that's how you engaged it, and maybe that's why he's now saying what he's saying and being incredibly dismissive and disrespectful.
Groupie. In the case of Black Panthers, it was Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, and Bobby Hutton. 3 people were assassinated. It wasn't the assassination, a critical assassination, in my opinion.
So 3 people. So just off the top of my head, he's leaving out, without any reference, as you'll see momentarily, to the counterintelligence program. He's leaving out all of that. He leaves out all of what we've been talking a lot about here lately in Orasami Burton's book, The Long Attica Revolt, which in many ways begins with the targeted assassination of George Jackson, who was a member of the Black Panther Party, targeted as such, and so on, that he does not acknowledge. He does not acknowledge the New York 21 trial and the setup there. Perhaps not everybody was assassinated there, but the obvious state effort to disrupt and set up and falsely charge and convict and cause, that's clearly in the documents there, cause fratricidal warfare that would cause some. So he's not going to mention the infighting caused by the COINTELPRO operations targeting the Panthers and others that got Panthers to kill one another. He doesn't mention anything about the Black Liberation Army. He doesn't mention anything about Twyman Myers being targeted and assassinated by police, and with them parading that as a victory. He doesn't say anything about Assata Shakur or Zaid Shakur, who's shot and killed by New Jersey State Trooper on the side of the road there. So he doesn't say anything about even the fact that Panthers survived attempts, like in the more famous L.A. Shootout with the LA chapter of the Black Panther Party. He doesn't talk about any of those shootouts that happened nationwide, where if they survived, to his point, they just don't get to be counted as being, to Finkelstein's point, that is, they don't get to be counted as assassinated and therefore worthy of such levels of importance. He doesn't say anything about the emergence and the evolution of the SWAT team as a response to the potential for urban guerrilla warfare, often represented by the Black Panther Party and parallel operations and so forth. He doesn't say anything about all that we've learned about the lesser known people that Breonna does attempt to make room for consideration, who were killed and targeted as Panthers or in associated. So he's doing a lot here to diminish what their potential threat and what their symbol was and why they were so targeted in his attempt to be the now crowned expert on Black history studies and radical movements and the response of the state to those movements. So this was just a quick off the top of my head note in response to watching this that I can come up with this. Were more room and time given for other experts and other folks to be part of this conversation or to check Finkelstein, I'm sure there's many more, and I'll invite you to put in the comments all those that you think I missed in this incomplete summary.
A critical assassination was Martin Luther King. But in the case of Martin Luther King, what was important about King was, in his last years, everybody deserted him. If you take people like Bayard Rustin, even Jesse Jackson, they would say, oh, Martin is morbid. Martin's always talking about his death. Martin is morbid. They weren't going to Martin Luther King's credit, and again, I don't like putting people on the pedestal.
by the way, he leaves out even the fact that Malcolm had been assassinated preceding all of that as a sort of attempted warning against people emerging in Panther-like formations. So and I guess he doesn't count the exiling of Robert and Mabel Williams in all of this is either, because I guess they would have been less telegenic and therefore less relevant. He doesn't, talk about the targeting and the chasing and the threats against Kwame Ture and many other. Like, he's leaving all of this out in order to, again, valorize those he feels deserve the credit, in this case, Dr. King, by showing that King himself was isolated by others in the struggle, which is in many ways the point Brianna was making, that is discouraging radical evolution of militant politics and assassinating those who represent that along the way as part of that discouraging effort. But it also leaves out the fact that King was himself losing popularity among Black and other radicalizing communities because of his perceived reticence vis-a-vis previous folks like Malcolm and in the emergence of a Black Power movement. So Finkelstein, as I've talked about before, needs a lot of help with these issues here, and why anyone, again, I'm not saying in this case Brianna invited this because of the way this section of the conversation evolved, but why anyone would not be more willing to be critical of him in these areas is fascinating. Albeit I do think Brianna does a fair job here. She often does in these interviews, but this is, again, just I think an absolute confession on Finkelstein's part.
They're not confessing. They're bragging.
But credit given where credit due. King was a very impressive figure in terms of his development. Like Bayard Rustin, even Jesse Jackson, they would say, oh, Martin is morbid. Martin's always talking about his death. Martin is morbid. They weren't going to...
And that wasn't their complaint of him. Their concern was that Martin was critical of the Vietnam War. He was critical of capitalism. He was critical of white liberals. Cough. He was critical of the military industrial complex. He was critical of the Black bourgeoisie. That's why it had nothing to do with him. Oh, he's morbid. That's not what they were concerned about.
To Martin Luther King's credit, and again, I don't like putting people on the pedestal, but credit given where credit due. Luther King was a very impressive figure in terms of his development. He started out a Black bourgeoisie preacher, had his PhD, had other degrees, and he was just going to be a little preacher in his father's church. And he developed. He tried more and more to be consistent with his principles. And the more he became consistent with his basic principles, the more radical he became. He wanted to be consistent.
And he was also being pushed by the very people and movements that Finkelstein, a few minutes ago, wanted to discredit. He was being pushed, that is, King was being pushed ever to the left by Huey Newton and the Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement. He was being pushed to become critical of Vietnam and Zionism and capitalism by the Black Power movement, by the very people and efforts that Finkelstein is saying were irrelevant and therefore unworthy of being targeted, in the same way that Dr. King would be targeted. It's a bizarre twist and a demonstration of his ignorance on this subject.
But consistency demanded a more and more radical trajectory. The others, they were ready to buy in. It wasn't the assassinations.
But Norman, you're describing a break between people who were genuinely radical and got assassinated, and people who weren't and who bought in, maybe also informed by the fact that all of their genuinely radical friends were getting assassinated.
No. Exactly. Again, he's already starting to say no, but go onto YouTube, Norm and anyone else, and watch the murder of Fred Hampton. Watch how Bobby Rush is impacted by watching his former comrade get assassinated, and watch how he learns how he and Jesse Jackson allegedly were themselves targeted, and why he hid out at or he was targeted, and why he hid out at Jesse Jackson's basement or something like that. So for him to dismiss, by the way, has he ever talked to any of these folks on or off the record? No one who has ever talked to any of these people on or off the record, no one who has ever read any of these memoirs or histories would be confused as to why certain people chose to make a political shift away from being threatened. I even talked about how recently I was on a panel in Prince George's County, and a local PG County elected official admitted on the mic that he said, I once upon a time would have been agreeing with Dr. Ball in these red, black, and green politics, but I didn't want to get assassinated. I wanted a more easy job, so I became a politician. So certainly at the levels of national and international figures, this is a major issue and concern, not to justify people's decisions, but to understand that would make sense that they would do that. And they did do that. And he's already dismissing it before Brianna's even finished her point, which is correct.
And became the Al Sharptons of the world. So I don't know how you can dismiss not just Martin Luther King, the Malcolm X, the Kennedys, like everybody who was in a position to actually be genuinely disruptive.
Look at his face.
And who had the buy-in of the public gets assassinated, and you don't have anything to do with the movement energy at the time.
No.
Well, let me ask you this, Norman. If you think that do you think that if Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy hadn't been killed, that we would be on a different, let's stay with it for a second. Do you think that we would have been on a different political trajectory?
Bobby Kennedy was the one who wiretapped.
I understood, Norman, but you know what the arguments are about why Bobby Kennedy was killed?
But he wasn't killed for
not to go back to the
what happened
discussion we started with.
I know I have, for better or for worse, I have a pretty sharp long-term memory. Bobby Kennedy
He may have a long-term memory that's sharp, but his analysis applied to that memory is terrible. It's quite dull, in fact.
was a total opportunist. When the anti-war movement
but he wasn't assassinated for being an opportunist.
There was a campaign, it was called to dump Johnson. It was led by this guy named Allard Lowenstein, who was a pretty revolting character himself. And then when McCarthy was successful in the campaign, Eugene McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy jumped in. He was never a person of the left. He was the one who, together with his brother, led the assassination and terror campaign against Cuba. He was.
But okay, Norman, I feel like you know that I'm making a narrow point of that. You know that I am. The argument is that for whatever reason, you can be the worst person in the world, but if you look at Tucker Carlson, you can be the worst person in the world, but if you stand up and say Israel bad, Israel genocide, you can have a target on your back. So this isn't a holistic. Wait a minute, this isn't a holistic assessment of anybody's politics. The question is whether, and you brought this up with respect to Zohran. The question is whether these assassinations were done because the feeling was by the people who executed them that there was a real risk that they posed to the establishment, to the status quo. Yeah, go ahead.
It all depends on by what you mean a real risk. There's a very good essay which you might want to read one day because you're a reader, and I know that. It's an essay by a Russian Marxist named Plekhanov, and it's called The Role of the Great Man in History, or The Great Man Theory of History. And he says the Great Man Theory of History is an optical illusion. That if Napoleon wasn't there, there would have been another person who stepped into Napoleon's place.
And look at how, again, Brianna has to interrupt here, and as do I. Look at how absurd this response is. I'm all for reading everything, but if you notice, the point I was making in criticism of Finkelstein in his engagement of Black studies and histories before was that he said I read Frederick Douglass and Du Bois and felt that was basically it, and then I could apply those analyses to the scholarship of today and be good. by ignoring decades of work, by ignoring the field and the study of a group of people and a particular history, Black people and Black history in the United States, by ignoring the radical militant studies and scholarship, by ignoring the political prisoners and their work, he can make these kinds of arguments, and then he's demonstrating it here by yet again. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to let the video run long enough, because he makes again the point, the suggestion that we read a Russian Marxist 19th century, whatever, 18th century philosopher for a commentary on why Black liberation struggles might be amended after a series of assassinations. I mean, it's just disrespectful to the field, to the community, to the history, to those, to that study, to say, I was there, I have a good memory, I get it, but let's refer back to something totally unrelated, totally out of context, and ignore all the relevant scholarship, new, old, contemporary, whatever, ignore the peoples themselves, the struggles themselves, and conclude, as Finkelstein did, that Black radicals had very little impact, had very little, caused very little in a response by the state, and at the same time, Mamdani is a legit threat for being assassinated. It's wildly bad and disrespectful.
The argument isn't about the power of an individual great man, and I'm very familiar with the great man theory of history. The question is whether or not it effectively neutered movements and prevented people from wanting to invest in said movements because there was real risk and threat to their lives.
Mamdani's the threat.
That reminds me of another point when Brianna used the word neutered. I know it's not exactly the same, but in the intelligence documents and state documents regarding counterintelligence program operations, and the like, the term neutralize is used. And neutralization or neutralizing someone can be anything from assassination to marginalization to discrediting, et cetera, and so forth. Finkelstein doesn't even leave room for any of that either. If you didn't get, in his mind, if you weren't one of the three people, which is itself ridiculous, to be specifically shot and killed as a member of the Black Panther Party by the police, then nothing else was in operation against you of note, and nothing that you were doing was of any real threat to any power structure, despite Hoover's claims that the Panther Party was the greatest threat to national security, or to the simple fact of all that was done to those efforts by the state as evidence of the threat that those people represented. It's almost impressive, his ability to avoid and disrespect this history.
Donnie poses, and it's a real threat. He has awakened a mass of people, just like Bernie Sanders, with the hope that a better world is possible.
Feel free to watch the entirety of that interview. I'll link it in the show description, and you can see more of what is said there and the context more fully than I've offered it here. I just wanted to show that little bit of a clip as it was sent to me by one of our wonderful O African supporters. So shout out to them. And please, I encourage all of you interested to send me more clips to be reviewed, discussed, responded to. And but yeah, I just wanted to point out that I stand correct in my criticism previously of Finkelstein's engagement with Black studies and Black history, and in this case, the particulars of the Black liberation struggle. At least somewhat of a salute to Brianna for her attempt at keeping him on track and checking him on some of that. And I hope I'm wrong in disagreeing that Mamdani, like Sanders, represents some sort of awakening politically, and that will not in itself be suppressed by Mamdani's relationship to the Democratic Party, as was also the case with Bernie Sanders. And to the extent that I'm wrong and there is this brand new awakening, I want to encourage all of us to engage further in other radical forms of engaging electoral politics so that righteous energy doesn't get suppressed and dissipated further, as I and others have been arguing for some time. But again, in short, I stand correct. Thank you very much to the Double O African community. Thanks again to the patrons and channel members who are getting to see this first. And peace to all of you. Like Fred Hampton used to say, only if you're willing to fight for it. And I'll catch you next time right here at I Mix What I Like, What I Like, What I Like, What I Like, What I Like.